I invite you for a moment to take out your Sidurim and turn to page 23. Turn to page 20, I'm sorry, what did I say? Page 63. Turn to page 63 in your Sidurim. This phrase, I'm sorry, is not transliterated, but I want to teach you the phrase and teach you a melody for the phrase, exactly in the middle of the page. The phrase that says, I hereby accept the obligation of fulfilling my Creator's mitzvah in the Torah, love your neighbor as yourself. Here's the tune. Hareini mekabel alai et mitzvat haborei ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha reacha kamocha. Hareini mekabel alai et mitzvat haborei ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha reacha kamocha odepam. Hareini mekabel alai et mitzvat haborei ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha reacha kamocha. I invite you to hold on to the phrase and onto the tune. As you heard, I just returned from a week and a half mega mission to Israel. By a show of hands, how many of you were on the mission? I know I see a number of you here, a bunch of you. Wonderful. Traveling with 240 members of the Minneapolis Jewish community, 50 of whom were from Bethel, have many, many stories to share. Far too many for one Shabbat sermon if you want to have lunch at a normal hour. We met Ethiopian immigrants in Rehovot and heard from Senator Boshowitz, who negotiated their harrowing rescue. We marked Holocaust Memorial Day with a meaningful ceremony that included Ambassador Michael Oren speaking. We ate dinner with the Druze family in their home. We rappelled down the cliffs of Machtesh, the Machtesh crater, and on and on. From a gala celebration in the southern desert to bird watching in the northern Hula Valley, we traversed the country, we learned its history, discussed its politics, and we ate, and we ate, and we ate some more. Going to Israel is always wonderful, but what made this trip truly unique was experiencing it together with a large group. We were first-time Israel travelers and Israel veteran travelers. We were 20-something-year-olds and 90-year-olds. We had clergy representing all the denominations and Jews of no denomination. And over the course of the week, we grew together as a community and strengthened our bonds one to another. I want to thank the Minneapolis Jewish Federation for their vision and their tremendous effort in making this once-in-a-lifetime trip possible. It was a good time to be in Israel. The weather was absolutely perfect. It was an interesting time to be in Israel. Protests against the judicial overhaul continued in full force. It was an exciting time to be in Israel as Israel celebrated its 75th Independence Day. And it was an appropriate time to be on a community mission to Israel. For doing so is the antidote to an event that occurred thousands of years ago and whose reverberations continue to be felt today. Here's what I mean, and I want to credit my neighbor, Rabbi Kalatsky, for pointing out this connection. We find ourselves in an important time in the Jewish calendar. It's called the Sphira, the days between Passover and Shavuot, and they are traditionally observed as a time of semi-mourning. That's why, for example, we don't perform weddings at this time. The story goes that 1,800 years ago, a plague broke out, killing 24,000 students of Rabbi Akiva. Now, the plague was not caused by lab contamination or a wet market. Instead, the rabbis say that it was self-inflicted. It happened, they say, because Rabbi Akiva's students didn't show honor one to another. Mipnei shelo nahagu kavod ze lezeh. Now notice, the problem was not that the students disagreed with each other. Disagreement is expected and even valued in Jewish thought. Disagreement can create a certain kind of dynamism. The problem was that they disagreed disrespectfully. Civil discourse broke down, and that God could not abide and sent a plague. Now, I'm not suggesting that we should understand this story literally, and I realize that God's response seems a bit extreme, but on its own terms, the legend points out the tremendous value the rabbis placed on kavod, on showing honor, and on productive, healthy conflict. It's also, interestingly, a critical assessment of Rabbi Akiva and his academy. Recall, it was Rabbi Akiva who taught that the most important principle in the Torah is the one from this morning's Parsha. Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, reacha kamocha. Love your neighbor as yourself. Zeklal gadol b'Torah. This is the most important principle the Torah teaches. Now listen to the full context of that verse. The Torah says, do not hate your brother in your heart. Yes, critique your brother, but love your neighbor as yourself. Now, to love your neighbor does not mean that there will be no conflict. To love your neighbor does not mean ignoring their shortcomings, but it does require dignified discourse and a willingness to hear and learn a different perspective. Apparently, Rabbi Akiva's students failed to learn this lesson, or perhaps he failed as a teacher to teach it so that they could learn it. However, the legend continues in the Talmud, Rabbi Akiva raised a new generation of students who better embodied this teaching. And so by diminishing our joy at this time of year and making this a period of semi-mourning, we are to recall the story of Rabbi Akiva and to redouble our efforts to uphold this teaching. Where do we start? In a world beset by conflict, lack of civil discourse, diminishing respect, how can we increase our love without avoiding productive conflict and without sacrificing our principles? It starts by turning the other into re'echa, which doesn't actually mean your neighbor. This is not about loving the people who live in your neighborhood. Re'echa means your fellow. Love your fellow as yourself. But how? Where do we start? The story is told of the 17th century Hasidic Sasover Rabbi, who one day was sitting at an inn. Next to him were a pair of peasants who were sharing a drink, making a l'chaim. After a few drinks, one peasant turned to the other and asked, "Do you love me?" His colleague responded, "Of course I do. Let's drink to that." The first one said, "Well, if you really love me, tell me, what causes me pain?" His colleague answered, "How should I know what causes you pain? I'm just here to have a drink with you." To which the first responded, "If you really loved me, you'd know what causes me pain." From that day on, every time the Sasover Rabbi taught, he taught his students that to love another is to know what causes them pain, what hurts them, what makes them suffer. How appropriately we have in our Jewish tradition, as we see in the words in our Siddur, that we are to begin each morning, each and every morning, with a reminder to love our neighbor. Hareini mekabel alai et mitzvat haborei ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha reacha kamocha. We are to affirm each morning the mitzvah of loving our fellow, and it's immediately followed by a prayer for learning. Learning about others was at the heart of our mission to Israel, and I think what people most valued on the trip. Within our group, participants loved getting to know each other, too, breaking down assumptions and discovering commonalities, including playing plenty of Jewish geography. When it came to experiencing Israel, participants particularly appreciated learning about the diversity of Israeli society by meeting with Bedouin and Druze and ultra-Orthodox and immigrants and on and on. Love, it seems, begins with knowing. And it is happening on a small scale all over Israel. We learned about an organization training, interestingly, Arab teachers to teach in Jewish schools. We heard from Rabbi Yoav Endi of the conservative movement's Kibbutz Hanaton of his efforts to establish a regional council with local Arab leaders. The work, he said, is slow and very hard, but he remains hopeful. While we were in Israel, 50 Israeli Jews from a religious settlement dined with their Palestinian neighbors in a post-Ramadan meal. The Palestinian dishes were made under strict kosher rabbinic supervision. We're a group of people that want the situation of violence to end, said a Palestinian partner in the program. Now, this may be a little bit harder to hear, but for me, one of the most impactful sessions was touring on the outskirts of Jerusalem with Dani Tirza. Known as Mr. Fence, Tirza is the architect of what the Israelis call the security fence and what the Palestinians call the separation barrier. The difference in language is telling. For Israelis, the fence has greatly diminished terrorist attacks. For Palestinians, though, the barrier has separated them from their family, their friends, their fields, and has restricted their freedom of travel. Both are true. Tirza gave one example of Israel's attempt to know and respect their neighbor. People coming from the territories into Israel have to pass through a checkpoint. It's similar today as passing through an airport security checkpoint. It takes an average of 20 minutes to go through. Well, Tirza explained that the best way to detect for plastic bombs in these checkpoints is to use canine units, but dogs are considered to be ritually impure in Islam. How could Israel be culturally sensitive while ensuring necessary security? And so Tirza devised a special hallway through which Palestinians walked, and that the air from that hallway was funneled into a room where the dogs were kept, and thus they would sniff for bombs out of sight. Now, I'm sure that Palestinians feel no love when they have to pass through an Israeli checkpoint. But let's give Israel credit for attempting to know and respecting their neighbors. At the same time, we have to understand the pain and suffering that sometimes is caused by these measures. There are many such efforts happening all over the country to get to know each other, to respect each other, though usually they don't make the news. To be clear, I'm not trying to paint some kind of kumbaya picture. When it comes to the Israelis and Palestinians, there are no easy or quick fixes. There's no love lost right now, and no peace process in sight, as Israel focuses its attention internally on issues of securing democracy and thwarting daily terrorist attacks. The same is true of Jews arguing over the judicial overhaul. It's complex and there's no quick resolution in sight. But in both cases, in all cases, the future begins by knowing and appreciating what causes another to suffer, by understanding the values they cherish, the stories that they tell about themselves, because love starts with knowing. You can't truly love your neighbor without knowing your neighbor. You can't love Torah without knowing Torah, and you can't love Israel without knowing Israel, not just from the news, but firsthand. And so I hope that I'm whetting your appetite for a Bethel mission to Israel. Of course, this principle applies equally and importantly to our own country here in America and to this community. We don't have to fly halfway around the globe to strengthen ties to one another. Today, after services at Kiddush, for example, you could find someone that you don't know, introduce yourself, spend a few moments talking. Outside of shul, you might begin each and every morning with the words of our Siddur that are a reminder and a call to action. Behold, I take upon myself the Creator's commandment to love my neighbor as myself, and then look for ways to actually live that lesson. In these days of mourning, these days of the Sefirah, when we're called upon to redouble our effort to love our neighbor, our classmates, our colleagues, our fellow citizens, we are to love them first and foremost by knowing them, by showing them respect, by learning from Rabbi Akiva and being the next generation of his students. And at the dawn of Israel's next 75 years, we're called upon to be Ohavei Yisrael, to deepen our ties and our love to the people and the place. Thus may we address her imperfections, celebrate her achievements, and usher in an era of peace. Reini mekabel alai et mitzvat haborei, ve'ahavta l'recha kamocha, re'acha kamocha. Let's turn ahead in our Sidurim, page 155.